now I'll turn it over to Shannon. I'd like to introduce her to you today. Shannon Lee Simmons is an award-winning certified financial planner, speaker, chartered investment manager, author, and founder of the New School of Finance. Her two books, Worry Free and Living Debt Free, are best sellers. She's a personal finance writer for the Globe and Mail, as well as CBC's radio Metro Morning Show, and is the money columnist there. And she's the financial expert on the Marilyn Denis Show. So welcome, Shannon. Today we have, yes, nice to see you.
You too.
Today we have a little bit of a different format. We're not going to be doing a full presentation, but rather we're having what we're calling a fireside chat with Shannon. So Shannon, I'd like you to begin with a little bit of information about financial matters related to caregivers in the province of Ontario.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you for having me. This is a really important conversation that we're about to have. So I thought that the poll was also very interesting, that 85% of the people just on this call alone are unpaid caregivers. And I think that's how the financial world ends up coming in contact with the caregiving world, is that, a lot of people are doing this and there's not an income necessarily supporting it. And the statistics that everybody can see on their screen right now come from the Change Foundation of the Ontario Caregiver organization. And so I just wanted to point out some of these before we kind of dig into some of the stuff that we're going to talk about. So 47% of the people polled said that they were employed full-time. So that's almost half the people that were caregiving. And then 13% said that they were part-time. And I also think that it's really important to note that down, if you just look a little bit below, that 20% of people are also retired and also becoming caregiving. So there's quite an array. There's self-employed people, there's people who are students, and then there's also employees. So each one of those different types of employment statuses brings an entire different slew of complexities to caregiving, different obstacles, different constraints, and all of that kind of meshes into how we manage our finances, because everybody has different constraints when it comes to their finances, depending on whether they're retired or whether they're still building their nest egg and all that kind of stuff. So this is a really important graph. And the other thing that I think was important, if you look on the other side of your screen, it's whether or not the people that were new to caregiving were experiencing financial hardship. So almost 1/3 of the people that were polled said yes. And I think that, there's something to be positive here. So 62% said no, which I think is something that's great. But I've been on the front lines of financial planning for over a decade. And when you have 1 in 3 people that feels that there's financial hardship happening to something that is happening in your life that is also a difficult time to begin with, regardless of the financial piece, that can be very scary. And, we don't want anybody to feel like there's financial hardship. And so there are things that you can do to make it a little bit less scary if you are one of those people who's feeling like the financial crunch of being a caregiver.
Thank you. That's an excellent summary, Shannon. So you talked about the financial hardship, the financial strain experienced by caregivers. What about caregiving specifically makes the financial piece so challenging?
So I think that with caregiving, there's a lot of uncertainty. I think that the number one thing with, especially if you're new to caregiving, so if you've been in it for a few years, things are, your new normal has normalized, if you will, and you might be in a groove of and you know what to expect. But if you're new to it, there might be increased expenses that you weren't prepared for. There's uncertainty as far as how long things are going to go on for with a lot of different people. So is this 3 months? Is it 3 years? Is it 10 years? We don't know exactly how things are going to play out a lot of the time. So that uncertainty is huge. And the other thing is that the emotional stakes are very high. They tend to be very high, as well as potentially the financial stakes. So you have high financial stakes, high emotional stakes, and a whack load of uncertainty. And often if it does come as a shock or a surprise, it can make people feel like they don't, like panic, like they don't know how this is going to play out. They feel unprepared, which makes them feel scared. And sometimes what I have seen is that when we're in that panic mode and we have these high stakes and we need to make big decisions, I think that's the key underlining thing here that I've seen with clients over the years is if you're new to caregiving and this is making you nervous, or this is there's uncertainty and you feel very afraid, which is I find it's very normal, then you have to make decisions. And so you have to make really difficult decisions during a really difficult time. And I think that whether it's financial or emotional, that's very unique to caregiving. And I think that combined with that uncertainty, it's a very unique set of constraints, and everyone feels it differently. But I would say that that's what makes it challenging. And with finances specifically, if you're employed, then you might think, oh, well, that person's employed, so at least they have income coming in so that they can maybe offset some of these increased expenses. But a lot of my clients who are employed are worried about taking time off. And so if they qualify for bereavement pay, or if they can take EI, how long can that last for? And then what happens when they have to go back to work? Can they afford the extra support systems once they're working full time? So that's a unique constraint there. For my clients who are retired caregivers, well, already you're in a situation where living off of your assets is makes you nervous because you don't want to run out of money, and now there's an increased expense. So how do you alter your lifestyle to accommodate those when you might have already been worried about having your assets last that long, or maybe you're on a fixed pension and the pension isn't going to go up ever. So it's like it's fixed. I mean, maybe for inflation, but you throw this uncertainty and potential increase of expenses in there. And it's really unique. And again, for anybody who's self-employed out there, taking time off, you don't qualify for EI. There isn't any other pay. So if you take time off of your business, then what happens to your income stream? So how do you fit in this part-time, full-time job potentially in addition to your actual job that you do to make money? And I think that combination of there's only so many hours and there's only so much money, and I have all of this to do is very unsettling for people when they first become a caregiver. That's very specific, unique to caregiving.
Well, Shannon, you've mentioned when you first become a caregiver. So if you're new to caregiving, from a financial perspective, what's the first thing that you need to think about?
Right. So I think the first thing to do is you want to map out a bit of a plan, because a plan is going to make you feel empowered, like you at least know that you're doing something, that you're facing it. So you don't want to ignore it, which I think sometimes if we are in panic mode, or if we are worried about something, we can deprioritize that money piece and say, oh, I'll just worry about that later. But then at 3 a.m. that money piece might come up and make you nervous at that point, which kind of spirals into other areas. So the first thing you want to do is you want to map out your finances and make a plan. And my real tip here is to make something that I call micro timelines. So micro timelines are like usually when you come to a financial planner, it's like, what does the next 30 years look like, or whatever, right? And then there's like this 40-page document, like a bunch of graphs. But if you're in a situation where your whole life has just been like whoop, flipped upside down, then you may not know what the next 30 years, let alone 3 years, looks like. And so that plan doesn't matter. We're not really worried about 30 years from now. We're about 30 days from now. And so I feel like if your life just got turned upside down and you don't really know what to expect, and there's shrouded in uncertainty, trying to plan too far out is just going to add to the anxiety. It's going to make you feel like it's chaos, and that it's going to rob you of some hope, or to focus your attention on what really matters. So you want to make the money stuff not be forefront. That's what we want so that you can focus on what matters. So by taking the stress out of money is how you can do that. You can take up less brain space. So making micro timelines, I think, is really important. And I have actually made plans with people who are new to caregiving where there's just a ton of uncertainty for 3 days or 3 weeks. So what are we going to do for the next 3 days? Okay, so what are 3 things that we can do over the next 3 weeks? So when you do it like that, you have these micro goals that go with it. So yes, we're always keeping the long-term financial goal of trying not to sink into debt, or like making sure that you're applying for programs and trying to bring that that income up, or making those bigger term plans, but we're doing it in such a way that you're planning it on a small timeline. I like to think of an analogy of like a road trip. So it's like in Canada, so it's like, from St. John's, Newfoundland over to Victoria. So we always know you're going to BC, but there's lots of different pit stops that have to happen in each province along the way. And so you want to make sure that we're mapping out like this stretch of road. So we're always going to BC. We know that. It's not that we're forgetting the big goal, but we have a lot of more control and a lot more predictability over the short run. And it's the same with money. So you can make yourself feel like you're taking action in a productive way, which can be very calming. You can make sure that you're doing any sort of damage control that you need to be doing to make sure that things aren't spiraling, which again takes the panic out of the financial piece so that you can focus on other things. And that's the really big important part about the financial piece here for caregivers, is that if you're stressed about money, then your brain's going to be worrying about that when there's so many other things that it needs to be worried about when you're in that situation.
I love the road trip analogy. That's very helpful.
Yeah, I use that one a lot because I think micro timelines are really important for across the board for financial planning.
So if you have a micro timeline, you probably need some budgeting tips or templates in order to make that really work for you and live within your financial situation.
Yeah.
Can you talk about budgeting tips and templates?
I can, for sure. I always say a little bit of a caveat here is that I'm going to say some rules of thumb, and they may not apply to everybody's situation. And so everyone loves the rules of thumbs, but they can also have the opposite effect of creating more anxiety and stress, because if someone doesn't fit into whatever I'm about to say, they might think, oh, that's me, I don't fit into this, and somehow my financial picture is not going to be okay. And that's not the case. It's very, very personal. That's why it's called personal finance. It's very personal. It's your life. It's up to you. But these are just some guidelines, I'd say, to make sure that you're kind of just checking in, like, relatively. And if we use our road trip analogy again, like, are we headed east or west? Like, that's really what this is. And then there's a whole bunch of ways that you can take a bunch of detours, but as long as you're generally headed in the right direction, things are good. So the thing that is zero fun about budgeting, I actually even dislike the word budgeting. It feels very constrictive to me too. But like I like to use like strategic spending guidelines. But there's only two ways to make it work, and you either make more money or you spend less. That's the simple math of it, and which is very frustrating because often if you're in a situation where you're in a caregiving situation where you feel like there's a lot of fixed things. It's like that rock and hard place situation where if you're retired, it's like, am I supposed to go back to work, or do I get a part-time job in retirement? Like, that seems like a fixed piece, or my assets are fixed now. I've turned the income top off. I'm not earning income anymore. And if you are still earning income, like if you're an employee or something like that, it's like, well, all of my time is now going here. So where do I make more? Like, how does that even happen? And so a lot of times with other financial situations that I'm helping people with, having that other, trying to diversify income or bringing in more money is an option. But for people who are in caregiving situations, I often find that it feels like it's not, because there's just only so many hours in a day. And there's lots of extra stuff that is going on in your life for you right now. So the idea of, having a side hustle or bringing in extra money or doing that kind of stuff, it just doesn't feel like it's on the table. So if that's something that doesn't feel realistic for you, then the only other option that we really have is to make sure that we're planning out or mapping out, as we said, on those micro timelines, what we need to spend, and then making sure that we kind of what's coming in, and then making sure that we have a strategy to kind of live within that, right? So that we don't end up in debt. And I think I say this to a lot of people who are going through some sort of personal crisis. And I also say this to people who are new to caregiving, not saying that everyone new to caregiving is in a personal crisis, but there's a very similar thing happening where your life doesn't look like yours anymore. It's new, there's uncertainty, and there's very high stakes. And so it's okay when that first happens to you that you just kind of survive. So financially, I mean, so a lot of times I'll have people that's like, well, how am I supposed to, like, let's say somebody who's not retired and they're still they're still working and they're still, building their nest egg, and maybe they are in the sandwich generation where they have a parent that they're now a caregiver for, and they also have young children at home. So this is actually a client of mine last week, and the questions are spiraling, right? So it's like, how do I afford to help my aging parent? How do I afford to put my kids through school? How do I do all of the things with what I've got? And so that's a big question, right? So really what we want to do is narrow it down and say, okay, we don't even know what government programs you might qualify for. We don't know what the cost of the care for your dad is going to be. We don't know that yet. So all we do know is that there's uncertainty. And so what we can do right now is just do our best to just hold the line. So instead of trying to save for retirement and save up for this and save, just let's try, your expenses just went right through the roof in the short run. Let's just try not to go into debt. That's literally your only job for 1 year. It's just like taking 1 year out of retirement saving isn't going to make or break your retirement. I feel like it can provide a lot of comfort for people to know that it's okay to just breathe for a second and try to get your financial bearings, because there's a lot of guilt that comes when we don't save. And there's a lot of guilt that can come from feeling, if you already feel unprepared and then you feel like you're not preparing again. But a lot of times it's just not financially possible. Because my worry, and I'm going to get to those big sweeping generalizations and check-ins in a second, but my fear and what I see sometimes with people who have been, who are trying to aggressively save during a time that just doesn't feel realistic, which can happen for many caregivers, especially when they're new, before they kind of acclimatize their life to this, whatever this new situation is I see these extreme budgets. So it's like, I'll never eat, I'll never eat out again or order a pizza again. I won't buy anything new. I'll never buy a new piece of clothes, or I'll never do anything again. So like these big, huge promises to try to reduce spending, to make room for some of the unforeseen expenses. But then those plans are unrealistic sometimes. And so what happens is that person will fail. And it's not because they're bad with money, but it's because the plan was totally extreme. And then, but what happens is when you fail at money, it can make you feel like you're bad with money when you're not. But when you feel like you're bad with money, and then you're in a situation where the stakes are very high and you need to make big decisions that are both financial and emotional, you lack that confidence that you're like a capable person that's able to do that with like their head screwed, like that's, you are totally okay to do that. And so I really don't want people to fail when they set up their budget, when they first become a caregiver, because I think that the domino effect of that is something that we don't think about if it doesn't work out. So in the beginning phases, this isn't for someone who's a seasoned vet who's been in the situation for a long period of time, but in the very, very, very beginning, it's okay to just stop saving and just breathe for a second and try not to go into debt. I think that is like the biggest tip. And if you do have to go into debt, that's okay. Do it with a plan. So, okay, I have to spend, $4,000 and I don't have it. It's going to go on a line of credit. This is happening. I have a plan to pay it off. I can do this. I can breathe through it. So it's like, it's coming. So it doesn't feel like you're spiraling. It's part of the plan. So then after all of that, when you're kind of looking at what's coming in and what's coming out on those micro timelines, 3 days, 3 weeks, 3 months, that's kind of, I usually like to use those timelines. Then I would say a big check-in, and this is the general, tip that I'm going to give, is that if your fixed expenses, so that's everything that you need to pay every single month, whether you like it or not. So whether that's your mortgage, whether that's your rent, your cell phone, your Netflix subscription, like whatever it is that's coming out every single month, you want to make sure that all of those bills, and that doesn't include groceries and stuff, because that's money that is not a bill. It's not repetitive. It's not the same amount every single month. It's not like promised to someone else. You get to choose when you go grocery shopping. Some weeks it might be $80. Some weeks it might be $100. It fluctuates, but your rent never changes. Your mortgage never changes. You want to make sure that those fixed expenses are not, or are close to 55% or less of your take-home pay. So everyone can write that down, and then I'm sure you'll calculate it. And if you're higher than that, it's okay. Why I use 55% is that if you think about it, so let's say your pension comes in, or your employment income comes in, or whatever comes in on a monthly basis, if over half of your money that you actually get to use is already promised to somebody else before you even get to go grocery shopping or fill up your car with a tank of gas, over half of it's already gone to things that you've signed on for, like their bills that you have to pay, then really the question of spending and saving is only happening with 45% of your income. And so the higher those fixed expenses are, the less and less flexibility you have between spending an amount that's sustainable and saving, or at least breaking even. So if your fixed expenses are above that, or they're going to be above that, it's basically a check-in that says like, this is going to be tight. It's going to feel scarier. It's going to feel tighter because there's just not as much wiggle room. So looking at those fixed expenses and trying to see if there's anything that you can sustainably reduce that doesn't make you feel like you're going to set yourself up for failure, that would be my big tip there.
Thank you, Shannon. What a great answer. I'm taking away moderation and pacing. So moderation in terms of being too aggressive, particularly in the early stages of caregiving, too aggressive about trying to continue to save, try not to spend too much, but rather pace yourself and breathe, give yourself a year, you mentioned, in these 3-day, 3-week, 3-month intervals.
Yeah.
You mentioned 55% of your take-home income going toward fixed expenses. And if it gets much higher than that, you have so little wiggle room in your discretionary spending that you might want to look at. If you have a plan for savings, for instance, you might want to look at adjusting that. In terms of prioritizing savings, what should caregivers consider when thinking about how to put money away? In these days, so few people, my daughters included, are contributing toward a pension plan. The economy has changed a lot since I was first starting out in my work. And so they need to put money towards their RRSPs and so on. Yeah. So how would you suggest caregivers prioritize savings?
That's a great question. And I think it's the most frequently asked question I get across the board is, we have all these competing goals. Who gets the most, what gets the first dollar, so to speak? So I think the big difference here is based on where you're at in your employment journey. So if you are still building, like your daughters that you were just saying, then at least time is on your side as far as you have maybe 15, 20, 30 years out until you're retiring. If you're already retiring or you're retired, then the goals and the priorities become different because we're not necessarily building up that nest egg in the same way that we are, when we're in our career earning years. So I'll answer it for both of those groups. So everybody, whether you're retired, whether you're close to retiring, or whether you are still in your wealth building years where you're building up that nest egg or trying to save up for retirement, if you do manage to have some savings, and hopefully anybody who's after that first year of becoming a caregiver, we're settling into a sustainable way of living that allows you to put a little bit of money away, that you want to be prioritizing consumer debt. Everybody, period, full stop. And so a lot of times, so that's credit card debt, expensive lines of credit. I'm not talking about your mortgage or your car. I'm talking about consumer debt on a credit card that's charging a high percent, or a line of credit. And here's why I would say that. So paying down debt first is not as fun as saving. It straight up isn't. I always use the example of, okay, so if you have a $19,000 line of credit, it feels so much better to see $1,000 go into your savings account than your line of credit go from 19,000 to 18,000. It just doesn't feel as fun. It doesn't feel as motivating. There's something about debt that it feels like you're paying off the past instead of building a future. And often there's regret, or there's guilt, or there's something about why we're carrying that debt. So every time we have to face it, when we log into our banking and put money that we feel like should go towards our future towards this, why did that thing happen? And it can send us on the spiral. So it's not as fun. But what I have noticed, it's not as fun to start. But paying down debt when you get close to the end, if you ask anybody who has had an amount that they want to pay down, once you see that it's possible and it's working, your plan is working, you start to see the finish line, you start to see the light at the end of the tunnel, well, then it feels, I would actually say, astronomically better than saving, because you're just about to get that monkey off your back that maybe has been tormenting you for quite some time. And the relief of that and the joy that can come from that is also great. It's just a delayed joy versus the instant gratification of saving into a savings account. So, but I do think that debt is important because, number one, it just mathematically, it's charging you more interest than you're likely getting in any sort of savings account. And if you were to say, well, my RSPs did 8%, which is fantastic, by the way. Your credit card is still charging you 19%. So I don't know, and that's guaranteed. So I don't know of a single investment that would give you 19% guaranteed every month. And if you have tips, please let me know. But so mathematically, it doesn't make as much sense. And two, it's just costing you more money every single month. So there's this minimum payment that you have to pay. So if you're already in a situation where your expenses are going up, then you have this minimum payment that you're paying every single month here that could be going elsewhere. So clearing up that debt is going to allow you to free up more cash flow so that you can either hold steady or continue to save. So debt across the board is what I would say is the best way to ready yourself for retirement. It's the best way to start building your nest egg, and it is a form of savings. So after you're consumer debt free, so again, not mortgage, not cars, not even necessarily student loans. I have mixed bag feelings about hammering out student loans because some people, they may never start. If their student loan is $50,000, it's like you might never actually start saving for anything else but your student loan. And if you can apply for government tax credits and stuff like that and repayment assistance, there might be an argument to be made that, okay, we can do other goals alongside of paying down that student loan. But consumer debt, no, I think it's a priority. And then the second thing, and this is something that is so important for caregivers, for everybody really, but especially those who have uncertainty lurking in their financial life, which for especially those people in their first year of caregiving, it's very much uncertain, is emergency savings. So often we'll see people pay down debt, or if they don't have debt, they go right to RSPs, they go right to TFSA, which is a tax-free savings account, because they want to build that nest egg. And a lot of the media and the marketing from the banks and everything, and even from your neighbor is like, oh, got to start that RSP, got to build that nest egg. And that's very true. But what happens is we skip over a very important emergency account. So emergency accounts work in two ways. So one, they keep us out of debt. So an emergency account, a lot of times people will be like, well, I want my money to work for me. And if it's just sitting there earning like 1.5% or 1% in a boring savings account, it can feel like that's foolish. Like somehow you're not being savvy. And then, somebody at the proverbial water cooler, which would now be like the Zoom chat or whatever, would be like, well, I invested in this and blah, blah, blah. And then immediately you're like, what is my money doing in an emergency account? I'm not making my money work for me. I'm so bad with money. But no, you're not. So an emergency account is just that. It sits and waits for an emergency. And then when you have one, you don't have to go into debt. So when an emergency happens, you feel like you're in control. Going into debt when you're in an emergency is like kicking you while you're already down financially. And so it makes the spiral even worse. So if something bad happens or something unexpected happens and you have a little bit of a cushion, it'll help you feel empowered, way more in control, less afraid of the uncertainty going forward, and like you can handle what's coming next. So there's an empowerment piece that happens with emergency accounts. So I think they're very important, and they're like a warm blanket of calm. So I think they do something to our central nervous system. So when you log into your banking and you see a little padding, even if it's $1,000, it doesn't have to be like, 9 months. So what's 3 months worth of spending? Like the average person can't get 3 months worth of their income saved up. That's a very unrealistic goal for so many people. So even any little bit of padding, when you log in and you see that, okay, like at least I have that. At least I know I have that. So that would be the same for anybody who's working, who is retiring soon, or already retired, because that's how we would prioritize any savings. And then the big change would be if you're still building your nest egg, then I would start building in RSPs and TFSAs for anybody who still hasn't retired or is close to retiring. And if you're already retired, then you don't need to be building up that nest egg anymore. If you're breaking even and you have room to save, even with the increased potential expenses that you've got from caregiving, I think you're winning at life. And I think that you can breathe. And I would just make sure that your emergency account is big, because we want to have a large amount of money between an emergency or an unforeseen expense in your retirement portfolio, because you don't want those two meeting, right? So if something happens that's expensive and out of your control and unforeseen, we want a big padding between that and your RSP so that you don't have to pull money from your RSP in order to combat that. So I would say that for retired caregivers, an emergency account is even more crucial.
So if I could interpret then, if you don't have that padding between an emergency fund and your retirement, or you don't have an emergency fund at all, one might consider that to be a financial red flag. So my final question for you pertains to the early warning signals that caregivers need to watch out for. How would you know if you're in a situation where your own financial health is on the line?
Right. So this is a really important question. Okay. So it's for the first year, if you've become a caregiver recently and you're still shocked by that, or there's still that element of shock, like I said, it's okay to just readjust your life and breathe. You don't have to put too much pressure on yourself to be, in a situation where you're saving, you're doing all this, like just like we said, pacing, like what Susan said, that's a great word for it, just pacing. If this is a long endurance run, it may not be a sprint, it might be a marathon. So pacing yourself and kind of getting acclimatized is very important. I would say if we're in a situation where after a year there's debt that's being accumulated during this year that has no chance of being repaid over a 2-year period, after that, like once you kind of get used to, what things are going to cost, what all of those unknowns right now have answers, right? So depending on where you're at in your journey, there might be a bunch of things that you have to make decisions on, but we're still waiting on answers. So you're still waiting on information, which is like the name of the game sometimes. So you're waiting on this piece and then waiting on that piece, and it's a domino. You can't answer this question until you have this answer, and you can't answer that answer until you have that. So once all those kind of pieces click into place and ultimately whatever you decide, whatever those decisions work out to, they're going to come at a cost. And so whatever that might be, at least now you know what the financial reality of what your new normal is kind of looking like. And so if you understand that, and it puts you in a situation where you're not able to pay down debt at all, and you're accumulating it, and it's not going to be able to be paid off within 2 years of sustainable, not extreme budgeting, I would say that would be a red flag that you're putting yourself in a situation where you're not going to be able to dig out quite easily. And depending on how old you are and how close you are to retirement, or if you're already retired, that can be nerve-wracking, and would be something that I would flag as, you really want to make sure that you are going into this with eyes wide open, and that you have a plan to get out on the other side. And the other thing I would say would be a red flag is if you are feeling like if you're retired and you are emptying out your retirement assets at an alarming rate. I think that, again, it's the flip side of taking on debt. So if you're working and you're going into debt, it's the same thing as being retired and taking out money too fast from your accounts. So I think in both cases, the red flag response would be, I think you might want to talk to somebody like a financial expert, financial planner, who is not trying to sell you anything. I think that's very important, that they are not invested in selling you insurance. They are not invested in selling you mutual funds. They are not invested in selling you RSPs, whatever, because they'll be able to give you an unbiased look at what's happening, and it won't be coming from somebody who has stakes, emotional or financial, in whatever your decision-making process is. So like if you go to family, they might have emotional stakes. So they might be giving you advice that is still not helpful for your red flag situation in your finances. And then if you go to a financial planner who really wants to sell you insurance, and they can freak you out, and then you end up having an extra expense there too. So let's just make sure that you have a plan for that, so you know where that line in the sand is. And then if you are in a red flag situation, like what are your options? Because as you keep going down a path that is like red flag on the field, like this is going to be really hard on the, like this might not stop. There may not be an end like on the other side of it, because we're already in a financial pickle, if you will. Generating options and solutions that are realistic, I think, is the most important thing that you can give yourself as like a form of wellness and like a form of self-care. I think financial planning for caregivers is a form of self-care, which is so necessary for people that are going through this. I often use the analogy of, so when you're on a plane, and if it was going down, you put the oxygen mask on yourself first, and then you help people who need your help, right? Like kids or elderly. So it's the same with money. So you're going to be a better caregiver if you take care of yourself, because it's going to be sustainable that you can do that, and you're not going to be in panic mode all the time. And you're going to be calmer, and you're going to be able to you're going to be able to make the marathon that it's going to be, because having your financial life be unstable for a long period of time. So like short-term financial instability, normal, that's going to happen. Long-term financial instability, which is what the red flags are kind of pointing to, is something that's going to it's going to alter the way that you feel all the time, because money is how we make decisions every day. It's like it unfortunately allows us to live our hopes and dreams and goals. So when that piece is unstable, we feel like our hopes and dreams and goals are fading, and that leads to bigger issues on a much more emotional level. So I would say that you want to make sure you have a plan, making sure that you're not in that situation where you're looking at long-term financial instability, and that you're generating options with somebody who has no stake in the game, whether it be financial or emotional.
What I've taken away are two things from what you've said so far in this presentation, but they're big things. There's a lot of specifics. The first thing is, I'm so impressed, Shannon, by how you've acknowledged and appreciate the emotional impact of financial discussions, financial pressures. You've mentioned emergency account feeling like a warm blanket. You talk about fear of the unknown, which is a very real fear for people, both in the caregiving function, but also when considering people's finances. And you've talked about nerve-wracking decisions. As we begin to think about how we might shift our relationship with our finances, you've talked about pacing yourself, planning, and I would add, I tried to find another P word, but consulting. So talking to experts. So pacing, planning, and talking to experts are three sort of big messages that I'm taking away from what you've said so far. What I'd like to do now, we have gone through the 5 questions that we had talked about in advance. And I'm just going to give people a little bit of time to type in questions in the chat box. I'm just going to give a few messages from the Ontario Caregiver organization. I'd like to encourage people to view today's webinar once it's been recorded and posted on the OCO Vimeo page, if you want to look at it again, or if you want to tell fellow caregivers about this video. Please visit the OCO's website for free information and resources. We have information and resources on caregiver mental health, educational resources on that topic, weekly online peer support groups where you can talk to others about who may be facing situations similar to the one that you feel you're in. We have a caregiver helpline that you can call anytime, 24/7. We have resources that support a caregiving journey during COVID, and we have many downloadable tip sheets to create support for caregivers. Our next webinar is scheduled for December 3rd on the topic of maintaining self-care during the holidays. specifically if you're caring for a child with developmental disabilities. And then on December 10th, on the same topic, if you're caring for an adult with developmental disabilities. And these webinars will also be simultaneously broadcast in French. So questions have been coming in, Shannon, and what I'd like to do is read the questions as they've come in, and we can have a little bit of discussion about your answers.
Great.
The first question pertains to emergency fund. If a caregiver is asking if I wanted to set up an emergency fund with my bank, what kind of account should I be asking for? A savings account, an investment account, and this caregiver is particularly concerned about fees that might be charged in holding funds in an account.
Yeah, this is a great question. Thank you. Okay, so absolutely not invested. Period, full stop. So when your money is invested, that means that it's in stocks or bonds. So a lot of times people will say, well, it's in a mutual fund. Well, a mutual fund is made up of stocks and bonds. It's kind of like a little package deal of stocks and bonds. And the reason that this is a whole other conversation, but my point is that invested money has risk, which means it goes up and it can also go down. It fluctuates, which is normal. There's a normal part of investing. You do not want your emergency account fluctuating. You do not want it going up or down. I mean, obviously you want it going up, but there's no guarantee that it's going to go up. So with anything that's going to grow, there's risk that it could go down at the same time. Leave the investments for your long-term assets, for your nest egg. So the type of stuff that you want in, or the type of account that you want for your emergency account should be the most boring savings account that you can possibly think of with the highest amount of interest. So interest does not mean invested. So interest, that's why it's considered a high interest rate account, but right now you might only be getting 1% or somewhere a lot of that because interest rates are quite low, which is why a lot of times people want to jump ship out of the emergency account and get right to the fun stuff because they want to invest for the potential for it to grow more. But nothing that you invest in is guaranteed. And I would hate for, the stock market to be having a correction or a downturn or a bear market like we just experienced earlier this year with the pandemic. And that's when your emergency strikes, when it's down the most, and then you have to claim that loss. So not invested. The keywords that I'm going to give you, if you have a pen, this is a moment to take it out. So you want to look for a high interest rate, non-invested, savings account that doesn't charge any fees. That is what you want, and those exist. So it's hard for me to give you specific examples. The last thing, there's 5 things. The last thing that you want to write down is that it is CDIC insured, which means the Canadian Depository Insurance Corporation insures the money up to $100,000, because right now there's a lot of online banks that are coming up and they offer very good interest rates because they don't have a brick and mortar locations like your regular banks. And so they have no fees, and they often offer a higher interest rate. I'm all for that. I think it's great. You just want to make sure that it's CDIC insured so that if anything did happen to any of the banks that you're in right now, the government would insure that. So those are the 5 things that you're looking for. And there's a couple of interest rate aggregators like Rate Hub, for example. It's a Canadian site. So if you want to write down ratehub.com, what they do there is every day they will say, hey, here's the top 5 bank accounts that you can open between credit unions and banks in Canada, and here's the interest rate that they're offering on their savings accounts.
Just a follow-up question, Shannon, on
Sure.
the same topic of emergency fund money. What about a TFSA? So there's no penalty for removing funds from a TFSA, and you can put them back in should you get a windfall. Do you have a comment on that?
Yeah, okay, so I love the tax. So just for anybody who doesn't know what the TFSA is, I think that's important to touch base on first. So the TFSA is started in 2009. So there's a lot of, it's not as well known as the RRSP, it's Big Brother. So the tax-free savings account, you can put money into it. It can go into cash or like high interest rate TFSAs, which if we're talking about emergency accounts, that's the only place that we should be talking about. The TFSA also has the option to be an investment account. So it can also be part of your long-term strategy and hold, stocks, bonds, mutual funds, index funds, or whatever in it. So first of all, the TFSA can be used for both things. So you could technically use it for an emergency account because it can be just a high interest rate TFSA and it has nothing to do with your investments. The reason I tend to not suggest a TFSA is because it's an awesome account that I think is very powerful that I don't want to waste on an emergency account. I would like it to be for your longer term investment account. And here's why. So the tax-free savings account is a tax shelter. What does that mean? Okay, imagine you have a house with a roof. Okay, so there's like a good shelter on it. So if you invest $100 and it grows to $150, which is the whole point of investing, okay, that will never happen in your emergency account because it's not invested. So you invest $100, it grows to $150. While it's in the house, that $50 that you've earned, you don't pay tax on it. It stays in the house like heat in the wintertime if you've got a good shelter. So that the TFSA does that, and so does the RRSP. It's called the tax shelter. The cool thing about the TFSA is that let's say that you took that $150 out. So you put in 100 and you took 150 out. So there's $50 that you have not paid tax on. The cool thing about the TFSA is that you never pay tax on that $50. Period, full stop. It's like so cool. And like when we're talking about $100 or $150, it seems like whatever. But if you have 20 years to save for retirement, that we could be talking hundreds of thousands of dollars that you've been accumulating over years, investing, that in retirement you pull out and it's not taxable, which when you're retired is very important because you want to make sure you qualify for CPP and old age security and that you're that you're not moving up tax brackets. So the TFSA is a wonderful way to like the TFSA and the RRSP should be used in tandem towards retirement. And so I don't like to utilize it for such use as your TFSA for an emergency, because the other reason is that yes, you can put money back into the tax-free savings account, but you can also risk over contributing that way. So the TFSA, you can take out money and then you have to wait till the next calendar year to put it back in. So what ends up happening with emergency accounts sometimes is people end up micro transactions in and out of it throughout the year. By accident, they end up over contributing, but they didn't actually, because it's like if it's 2020, if it's 2020, which is this year, and I put in 5,000 and then I took 5,000 out, I have to wait till 2021 to put that back in. But then if you're like popping in and out, then the government thinks you put in like 15,000 in 2020, which you did technically, because you have to wait till you get that room back next year. So for me, the long and short of it is, if you're just starting out and you're not close to maxing at the TFSA, then go for it for an emergency account. But you're not going to be, if it's not invested, you're not going to be earning that much interest in it anyways. And so the tax-free nature of it is kind of wasted. And I would love to mentally have a break there where we use that account to like really do some damage with our long-term retirement savings, because I think it's a very powerful account that doesn't get a lot of love.
Thank you, Shannon. So I have several questions on government funding. And I think what I'm going to do is take that question back and see if we might be able to approach the question of government funding for Alzheimer's, government funding for caregiving, income guidelines, and so on. I'm going to take those questions back and see if we might be able to create a webinar topic that addresses those specifically.
That's a great idea.
A helpful audience member suggested that the third P in PACE, plan, and consult could be proactive. Be
Love
proactive, which is, thank you very much for that comment. We're going to have a rapid fire run now. So I'm going to ask questions in rapid succession because we just have 5 or 7 minutes left.
Okay.
Can you give us some information about income tax implications of some of the expenses that we may incur in caring for someone?
Okay, so the first thing I would do is talk to your accountant or your tax preparer about that, because there are so many different, if it qualifies for like medical tax credit, some things might qualify for that, or medical equipment, and it may not be you, but maybe the person that you're caregiving for, if it's for them and it's part of your household income, then there might be a lot of things that qualify for that. So I think that the medical tax credit is something that you want to be paying attention to. The disability tax credit is also something that you want to be paying attention to, whether you qualify or not for that, or whether the person that you're caring for will qualify for that as well. So truly, the rapid fire answer is talk to your tax preparer about that, and making sure that you are trying to maximize all of the different programs that are out there for whether it's medical or disability.
Thank you. Following up on the disability tax credit, do you have any advice on transfer of disability tax credit expenses? Now, I'm thinking this might be from spouse to spouse, perhaps?
Yeah, if it is spouse to spouse, there should be. But again, I would defer to your tax person on that, because everybody's tax return is so unique and there's so many custom things in the disability tax credit. The person that qualifies is I believe if you're a spouse, you can, but I would definitely defer that to your accountant.
Mm-hmm. Now, here's a take on a slightly different way of looking at caregiving, someone who's planning to be a caregiver in the future. How should a person plan financially now when they expect to become a caregiver in the future? What kind of expenses should one anticipate?
Well, that depends on the type of caregiving that you're doing. So I can't answer that. That's like asking how long a piece of string is. But here are my tips. Number one, the person that you I've had this type of conversation many times with parents and their adult children. So number one, making sure that the person that you are preparing to caregive for is financially sorted. So do they have their will, power of attorney? Are they on board with what's happening? Do they have debt under control? Like, do they have their financial house in order? I think that is the first thing that you should be doing. And having them being a part of that conversation is so incredibly critical, so that none of this takes any of you by surprise, because that could be fraught. And so let's make sure that that person is on board with the plan. They know what the plan is, and they have all the legal documentation, you know what passwords are, all that kind of stuff. So that's number one. That's a huge problem is if something takes somebody by off guard, they don't have access, they don't know who the financial planners are, they don't know who the accountants are, anything like that. So making sure that you're having those family meetings. And then two, I've had a lot of creative ways that this happens. The most basic way in a rapid fire response would just be to make sure that after their financial house is in order, that your financial house is in order. Remember the mask first, then you help others. So making sure that you're in a financial position where you could support financially, and knowing what that support could look like. So is it something that you could work into your monthly budget? Is it something that you are saving for now that would be a big expense later? We don't know. So if you're sorted, then how much support could you share and could you take on, and as far as a financial expense goes to you. So once you have your financial plan in order, you'll know what that looks like. So then when and if you do become a caregiver, you're going to feel like you are prepared. The person that you're caring for is prepared, and you know where that line in the sand is between what you can and can't help with.
So we've got another P word: prepare, pace, plan, and be proactive.
Yeah.
You mentioned a couple of times a tax preparer. We have a question: how would you find a tax preparer, or someone who can help you with your tax?
Yeah, so I think, okay, so this is a great question. So the tax preparer is the same as an accountant, only sometimes you might just have somebody who's registered with the CRA as an e-filer. They may not be a CPA. That doesn't mean that they can't do your taxes. One of the benefits to using a tax preparer is that they may not be as expensive as an accountant, like a CPA. I would start with resources of people who are in your situation. So getting a referral from somebody who is like a millionaire, who has like a family trust and, you know, all these different corporations, and they use this person, like that might not be appropriate for you. You want somebody who specializes in the disability tax credit. That's something that you think you can take advantage of, that specializes in caregivers in general, and making sure that they know what to be looking for as far as the medical tax credit goes and stuff like that. So, and having dependents and all of that. So start with people who are in your community as caregivers and ask them where they go and who they use. I think that's a wonderful way to get yourself a tax preparer that is going to understand your situation and is going to be able to ask the questions that you don't even know that you don't know.
Shannon, you mentioned medical tax credit. Is that the same as disability tax credit, or are they two separate tax credits?
They're two separate things.
Okay.
So the medical tax credit, any Canadian can qualify, or can have qualifying expenses for it. So for example, it depends on what province you're in, but in Ontario, for example, even our RMT, like registered massage therapist, or psychotherapy, or the different services, or different types of medical equipment, even if you're not in a caregiving situation, or the person, or you are not a person that's receiving caregiving, if you have those expenses that weren't repaid from a benefits plan, you can put them towards the medical tax credit, which means that if they're over a certain amount of money, this is a little technical, 3% of your net income, but then you get a tax credit based on that. So it's really great for people who have high medical expenses but no benefits. That is the people that are benefiting from that. So if you're in a caregiving situation, your medical expenses might have just gone through the roof, and like all of those ancillary costs that may not be covered by your benefits could qualify for that. That also includes trips to the hospital, parking, meals, all that kind of stuff. So that's specific to that's specific to medical, and you don't have to qualify for the disability tax credit to get that. The disability tax credit is a completely different thing. You do have to qualify from like a medical physician, and then it opens the door to a bunch of other things. So you could qualify for an RDSP, which is a registered disability retirement savings plan, which is like an RRSP, but for someone that qualifies for the dividend tax credit, there's also a tax break. So they're very different things.
Thank you, Shannon. This has been so informative, and I know people have really appreciated the expertise you've brought to this webinar. We have to wrap it up now, I'm sorry to say, but I would like to thank you very much. And on behalf of the people who attended the webinar, I express our gratitude to you, Shannon. That was excellent. Very, very well done. Thank you to all of you who have attended today. We will be posting an evaluation survey. You will see that in the chat box. Please take a minute to complete this survey. Your feedback is valuable to us as we strive to increase and improve our programming to meet the evolving needs of caregivers. We hope you can join us again. Please visit the events page on the OCO website for updates and registrations for all our events. On behalf of the Ontario Caregiver Organization, I'd like to thank our speaker today and all of you who have attended. We hope that you'll tell others about these webinars and about the resources that are available on the OCO website. That will help us reach out to more caregivers in Ontario. Thank you very much, and good afternoon.